Chapter 2 in Macroeconomics. The U.S. economy. Economic outcomes vary greatly across nations. We go back to these three core questions: what, how, and for whom. What goods and services does the United States produce? How is that output produced? And for whom is the output produced? Let's look at what America produces. The United States has 12% of the world's arable land and less than 5% of the world's population. Yet it produces more than 20% of the world's output. GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's borders in a given time period. That last part is important. Now, comparatively, the market value of output, or GDP, is a basic measure of an economy's size. The United States has $13.8 trillion of dollars, China at 7.1, Japan, Germany, Britain, Russia, South Korea, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia follow. Now we head into per capita GDP. Per capita GDP is the dollar value of GDP divided by the total population, which is average GDP. So you take the GDP dollars, divide by the total population, 300 million for United States, and then you get the output per person in an economy if all output were divided up evenly across population. Economic growth is an increase in output, real GDP, and expansion of possible production possibilities. This is due to an increase in curve or increase in technology. GDP per capita around the world, the United States is number 1, followed by Canada, Japan, France, and South Korea. Generally, the more advanced nations have higher GDP per capita. China is not even on the list. Interesting. Growth in per capita GDP. To attain growth in GDP per capita, the economy needs a higher rate of GDP growth than population growth. U.S. output has grown by roughly 3% per year, and the U.S. population grows by only 1%. So you can increase in per capita GDP by having less population growth, or increasing output by increasing technology. So U.S. output and population growth. The growth of output in the United States has greatly exceeded its population growth. Starting in the 1930s, by the end of the Great Depression, and it spiked upward and is continuing. GDP growth versus population growth. The high-income countries. The United States, with an average GDP of 2.7, has a growth rate of 0.9 and a per capita GDP of 1.8. So populations of rich countries are growing slowly, and gains in per capita GDP are easily achieved. Now in low-income countries such as China, India, Madagascar, in the poorest countries, the population is still increasing rapidly, making it difficult to raise living standards. Because it's advancing so fastly, the population is also advancing, so it's hard to surpass that. Now we go on to the mix of output. The mix of output includes goods and services. A century ago, about 2/3 of the U.S. consisted of goods, while only 1/3 consisted of services. Today, 75% is considered services, not goods anymore. So you have a changing mix. In the 1800s, up until about mid-50s, it was largely agriculture. Mining and manufacturing are pretty consistent, and services have grown within the past 40 years, substantially. Now we move on to the developmental patterns. The transformation of the U.S. into a service economy is a reflection of high incomes. So you have lower incomes with agriculture, medium with mining, manufacturing, construction, and then services have higher, generally speaking, across the board. Always exceptions, though. So citizens in poor countries don't have enough income to buy many services, so production is weighted towards goods, as it was in our country about 100 years ago. So how America produces. Production in every nation depends on its available resources, and differences in GDP across countries is explained by the how these resources are used. So factors of production again include land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Resource inputs used to produce goods and services: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So we go to human capital. Human capital is the knowledge and skills possessed by the workforce. High school graduation rates in the United States are over 85%, so you have a high knowledge and high skills. And in many less developed countries, only 1 out of 2 youths attend high school. much lower gap. So, in high productivity of the American economy is explained in part by the quality of its labor resources, 85%. Workers in poorer, less developed countries get much less education, the 1 and 2. So you have the United States at 88% enrollment in secondary schools, and in the middle income countries it's 62%, and the poor it's only 24%. Kind of a catch-22 for those poor countries. Capital stock is America has accumulated a massive stock of capital. Infrastructure includes machinery, factories, buildings, and is capital intensive, which is production processes that use a high ratio of capital to labor inputs. So productivity, we have high productivity here. Productivity is the output per unit of input, such as output per labor hour. And the high productivity of the United States economy results from using highly educated workers in capital-intensive production processes. Factor mobility. Our continuing ability to produce also depends on our agility in reallocating resources. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship move from one industry to another in response to the change in demands and the change in technologies. Now, technological advances help that. Technological advances are finding new and better ways to produce the same old goods and services. Whatever technology advances, an economy can produce more output with the existing resources. This would push the PPC curve to the right and have more possibilities to produce. This brings us into outsourcing and trade. Advancing technology facilitates global resource use, and outsourcing allows United States workers to pursue their comparative advantage in high-skill, capital-intensive jobs. Economic freedom and growth. As nations become freer, relying more on markets and less on government, GDP growth is enhanced. So you rely on more markets and less government, so GDP grows. Government plays a critical role in establishing a framework in which private businesses can operate. So the role of government is to provide a legal framework, protecting the environment, protecting consumers, and protecting labor. This is all alleged, by the way. Providing a legal framework is one of the most basic functions of government. It's to establish and enforce the rules of the game. And by establishing ownership rights, contract rights, and other rules, the government lays the foundation for market transactions. Secondly, they protect the environment. Externally is defined as the costs or benefits of a market activity borne by a third party. To reduce the external costs of production, the government limits air, water, and noise pollution and regulates environmental use. So basically the government is protecting the environment so we don't destroy it by mining coal, or whatever. Thirdly, they protect consumers. The government prevents individual firms from becoming too powerful. The government also regulates product safety, which is why the USDA, FDA, OSHA, all of those federal institutions exist. Now, a monopoly is a firm that produces the entire market supply of a particular good or service. These were popular back in the day. Oil barons, Model T, JP Morgan, all that. And finally, protecting labor. The government requires how labor resources are used in production processes. In the United States, child labor laws prevent minor children from being exploited. And government regulations also set standards for workplace safety, minimum wages, fringe benefits, and overtime provisions. So they do 4 things: protecting labor, protecting consumers, protecting the environment, and laying a framework to develop market transactions. Now if we go to striking a balance between those 4. Government interventions are designed to change the way resources are used. Government failure might replace market failure, leaving us no better off and possibly worse. Now we go into the final question: for whom America produces. And this is determined by how many goods and services one gets. Largely depends on how much income one has to spend. So if your spending goes up, your income goes up on goods and services. The U.S. income distribution, called income quintile, is 1/5 of the population rank ordered by income. That's 20%. The top 20% or quintile of United States households get half of the income, so 20% get 50% of the money. And the poorest 20, or quintile, get less than 4% of all income. The distribution of income is the richest fifth gets 50, the second fifth gets about 23%, third fifth gets 15%, fourth gets 8.7, and the lowest fifth gets 3.4. So you're looking pretty good. In the highest fifth is above 100,000. Above 150,000. The second fifth is 80, third fifth is 50, fourth is 29, and the lowest. So I'm in between the fourth and the fifth. Between fourth, fifth, and lowest fifth right now. Between 12 and, yeah, I'm in the lowest right now. But in 5 years' time, I plan to be in the second fifth, which is about $80,000. That is my goal. Now we go into global inequality. Income disparities are greater in many other countries than the United States. Poor people in the United States receive much more goods and services than the average household in most low-income countries. So income share of the rich is a graph share of total income received by the top 10. Now we have the lower income at 65%, Bosnia 51, Haiti at 50. As the countries develop, our higher income percentage goes down. So now we're on ending global poverty. Over 3 billion people still live in poverty, and the World Bank has an ambitious goal for 2015. Is to reduce poverty and hunger by 1/2, achieve universal primary education, reduce child and maternal mortality by 2/3, and reduce half the number of people without access to potable water. Those are some lofty goals in 4 years' time. Ending global poverty, people in rich countries also aspire to higher living standards. The challenge is to find the right balance between market and government forces. And that is Chapter 2. Next we'll be covering Chapter 5 in the U.S. economy, macro, a global view.